Have you ever looked at a house so grand, so perfectly symmetrical, so monumental in its ambition that it felt like it was never meant to be lived in, but to be worshipped from afar? Winfield Hall is that kind of place, built not merely of marble and steel, but of trauma, ambition, and illusion. It is one of the most chilling legacies of the Gilded Age. Nestled along Long Island's Gold Coast, it does not welcome guests. It intimidates them. The first time one lays eyes on the Great Staircase, rumored to have cost $2 million alone, there is no warmth. There is only grandeur and the unmistakable weight of sorrow. The story of how this mansion came to be is not a tale of triumph, but a deep wound masquerading as victory. Before we open its heavy doors and step inside the mind of its creator, take a moment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. If the opening of this story has intrigued you, share the video with a friend who appreciates dark histories and mysterious legacies. By the end, you'll understand why the title's mystery isn't just about a house. It's about what it costs to build a life that tries to outlive death. At its center stands Frank Winfield Woolworth, a man who climbed from mud to marble with nothing more than 5-cent coins and a fanatical need to prove himself. His tale is not of the smiling American dreamer who builds an empire for his family and dies surrounded by love. No. This is the story of a lonely emperor who built himself a throne of stone and sat upon it in silence. Born on April 13, 1852, Frank Woolworth came into a world where one's worth was measured by land, harvest, and muscle. His father, John Woolworth, was a harsh farmer in Rodman, New York, and Frank hated everything about that life. The mud, the labor, the endless repetition. He was sickly, withdrawn, and obsessed with store windows. Even as a boy, he seemed more drawn to illusions of power and beauty than to anything rooted in his surroundings. He failed at his first job as a store clerk because he couldn't master the art of haggling. In an era when salesmen were expected to fight for every penny, Frank, with his soft voice and a noticeable stammer, seemed doomed to fail. Yet it was this very failure that became the seed of revolution. At Ogilvy and Moore, he proposed a radical idea: a table of unsold goods, each sold for 5 cents. No haggling, no tension. This was more than a pricing gimmick. It was a subtle social upheaval. He democratized shopping. Suddenly, even the poorest farmer could feel dignity while purchasing a small trinket. No one laughed at him at the counter. No one judged the size of his wallet. And in this quiet dignity, Frank saw an empire. His first store opened in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in 1879, making over $100 on the first day. The success was meteoric, but so was the transformation of the man behind it. With each new store and each conquered city, Frank became less of the shy farm boy and more of a calculating monarch. His admiration for Napoleon Bonaparte took on near religious tones. Here was a fellow outsider, born to nothing, who dared to crown himself emperor. Woolworth saw in Napoleon not just a historical figure but a blueprint for personal ascension. He began to see business as warfare, his stores as outposts, and his fortune as his crown. But like the French emperor he idolized, Woolworth also bore a deep insecurity. The old money elite of New York never fully embraced him. He was still the 5-cent man, the discount merchant, an upstart in a world that worshipped pedigree. And so, as others threw lavish balls and flaunted their European titles, Frank responded the only way he knew, with marble. The turning point came in 1916 when his original Glen Cove estate, a grand wooden home, mysteriously caught fire. Most men would weep at such a loss, but Frank didn't shed a tear. Those who were there that night described his face as unreadable, eerily calm. Some even whispered that the fire was too convenient, too perfectly timed. It freed him. It burned away the compromise. From the ashes of that mansion, Frank resolved to build not just a home but a statement. Winfield Hall would not contain a single piece of wood. It would be fireproof, eternal, and unapologetically grand. He summoned C.P. Gilbert, the famed architect of fortress-like Fifth Avenue mansions, and gave him one simple instruction: build me a palace worthy of an emperor. The budget was unlimited. The timeline was impossible. Frank wanted it done in less than a year. The cost eventually soared to over $9 million, more than $200 million today. What drove a man so obsessed with bargains and cheap goods to commission a palace that echoed Versailles? What inner ghost was he chasing? The answer lies in that fundamental tension between origin and ambition. Frank hated where he came from. He wanted marble where there had been manure, gold leaf where there had once been frost-bitten fields. He wasn't building a home for his family. He was building a monument to erase his own shame. And yet, in doing so, he carved his loneliness into stone. The tragedy of Frank Woolworth is that he succeeded too well. Winfield Hall was built in record time, rising like a specter over Glen Cove, as white and cold as a mausoleum. From the outside, it looked like victory. But inside, the halls echoed with something darker. His wife, Jenny, was already fading into dementia. His daughters felt suffocated by the cold grandeur of their new cage. The walls didn't radiate warmth. They whispered despair. Visitors were awed, but rarely stayed long. The silence was too heavy, the marble too cold. It was said that walking through the house felt like trespassing through a dream not meant for the living. Frank walked those halls alone, dressed in tailored suits, surrounded by servants who never spoke unless spoken to. The only voice he seemed to truly respond to was that of history, the history of Bonaparte, whose bedroom he meticulously replicated for himself. Yet even as he tried to recreate the empire of another man, he forgot that Napoleon died in exile, and so would Frank, in a different kind of exile. One lined in gold. What Woolworth failed to grasp is that architecture can preserve legacy, but it cannot fabricate love. A house built on ambition cannot nurture a family. By trying to transcend death through marble, he built his own psychological tomb, one that no fire could ever cleanse. He defeated flames, yes, but not loneliness, not regret. Winfield Hall stands as a warning carved in stone, a warning that even a man who sells dreams to millions can die haunted by the silence of 56 rooms filled with nothing but echoes of what might have been. Construction of Winfield Hall began not with blueprints, but with an ultimatum. Frank Woolworth, having watched his first home reduced to ash, demanded the impossible from architect C.P. Gilbert, a fireproof palace, built entirely from marble and steel, completed in under 12 months. In the world of classical architecture, this was sacrilege. Creating a grand residence of this scale was a process that traditionally took years of careful planning, sourcing, and execution. But Frank wasn't interested in tradition. He was interested in domination. Gilbert, a master of the Beaux-Arts style and already responsible for several iconic Gilded Age mansions, initially balked. But when Frank offered him limitless resources and an army of workers, resistance became futile. What followed was less a construction project than a military campaign. Hundreds of artisans, engineers, masons, and decorators were mobilized. They worked in rotating shifts under floodlights that turned Glen Cove's peaceful nights into an otherworldly spectacle. Residents watched in awe and discomfort as the white skeleton of a mansion rose faster than logic allowed. Rumors swirled that Woolworth had struck a Faustian bargain to complete his fortress against time and death. The result was a house that did not merely reflect wealth, it weaponized it. Winfield Hall was designed to overwhelm its style, a fierce blend of Italian Renaissance and French classicism, borrowed heavily from royal palaces in Europe. This was deliberate. Woolworth wasn't building a retreat. He was building a throne. The marble wasn't just white. It shimmered like bone in moonlight. The dimensions weren't generous. They were imperial. Rooms were cavernous. Ceilings vertiginously high. Windows vast and unforgiving. Everything was scale, power, and echo. There was no softness, no intimacy. This was architecture as intimidation. The most iconic symbol of this intention was the grand staircase, made entirely of pink marble. It was so expensive and intricate that its cost alone equaled that of an average mansion. Walking up those steps was meant to induce awe. Each footfall reminded visitors that they were in the presence of someone whose wealth transcended conventional limits. But the psychological effects didn't end there. The interiors of the 56 rooms were not decorated for comfort, but for command. Stone floors, bronze fixtures, steel-reinforced beams. Every element served Woolworth's obsession with control and permanence. There was virtually no wood in the entire structure. Fire, the force that once took everything from him, had no chance here. Yet in eliminating its threat, Frank also eliminated warmth. The most revealing space of all was the music room. Here, Woolworth installed a massive pipe organ from the Aeolian Company. It dominated the room like an altar, its pipes reaching toward the ceiling like metallic trees. Frank couldn't play it himself, but that wasn't the point. The organ had an automatic playback system, and he would sit in the dark, commanding the room with music. He favored thunderous compositions, crashing symphonies that shook the floors and rattled windows. The lighting was rigged to shift colors with the mood of the music. Guests found it unsettling. Servants whispered that the music sessions bordered on ritual. Woolworth didn't want to be entertained. He wanted to conjure power. It was in this room that the line between reality and fantasy began to blur. The organ wasn't just an instrument. It was his scepter, his command over the unseen, a godly echo in a man-made Olympus. But even this spectacle paled in comparison to the Empire Room, Woolworth's personal bedroom, modeled in exact detail after Napoleon Bonaparte's chambers at the Château de Compiègne. This was the beating heart of his delusion. The canopied bed, the imperial insignias, the carefully matched tapestries and gilded decor. It was not just homage, it was transformation. Woolworth didn't merely admire Napoleon. He began to see himself as a modern incarnation. He even commissioned a life-sized portrait of the emperor with subtle facial adjustments to resemble his own features. Each night, he lay down beneath golden eagles and velvet drapes, not as a shopkeeper from upstate New York, but as a ruler of empires, conqueror of the old elite. And yet, the very features that were designed to dazzle also betrayed something darker. The mirrors positioned to reflect endlessly into themselves created the effect of being watched. The stone walls echoed every whisper until privacy became a fiction. Even footsteps seemed aggressive, amplified by marble and steel. The rooms were grand but uninviting. The bathrooms were equipped with gold and silver faucets, the ceilings with carved plaster and gold leaf. But guests reported feeling watched, unnerved, even oppressed. Woolworth's vision had succeeded in making a statement, but it had failed utterly in creating a home. What he had built was a symbolic fortress, a place where he could rule uncontested, unchallenged, uncomforted. The house did not serve its inhabitants. It subdued them. His wife, Jenny, slipping into dementia, was barely a presence within its halls. His daughters, particularly Edna, felt chilled rather than inspired by the surroundings. Where others might have seen a triumph of architecture, they saw isolation. For Frank, every golden detail was a declaration of victory. For his family, it was a prison sentence. The house did not welcome laughter. It swallowed it. The servants, as many as 70 at one point, moved like ghosts through corridors too large for any real human interaction. Every curtain, every fresco, every slab of imported marble was a monument to control, to fear of loss. There were no creaking floorboards, no scent of wood smoke or familiar comfort. There was only stone, endless, cold, beautiful stone. And in that stone, Frank attempted to carve away death. But the irony was already building, room by room. Even as the final frescoes were painted, and the final shipments of silk and bronze were installed, something invisible had already begun to grow inside the house. A presence that had nothing to do with ghosts, but everything to do with grief. The grandeur of Winfield Hall was not a shield. It was a mask. And behind it, cracks were forming. Psychological ones, emotional ones. The kind of fractures that stone cannot hold back. The truth was simple and devastating. Woolworth had succeeded in making the most unburnable house in America, but he had also made it unlivable. He had raised a palace to withstand time, but not sorrow. And the sorrow was coming. By the spring of 1917, Winfield Hall stood in triumphant silence. The walls gleamed. The marble staircases reflected candlelight like polished bone. The Empire Room, with its imperial drapery and Napoleonic grandeur, was finally complete. And yet, for all its might, the house was helpless to stop what came next. The tragedy that would define the Woolworth legacy began not within its marble halls, but across the East River, in a room at New York's Plaza Hotel. There, on May the 2nd, Edna Woolworth Hutton, Frank's favorite daughter and heir to his empire, was found dead. She was only 33 years old. The official cause was mastoiditis, a sudden complication from an ear infection, but few believed it. Whispers filled salons and supper clubs. Edna, fragile and refined, had long suffered in silence. Her marriage to investment banker Franklin Hutton, orchestrated with all the fanfare of a royal alliance, had devolved into a scandal. Hutton's infidelities were no secret. His cruelty was thinly veiled. And Edna, for all her wealth, was powerless. No fortress of marble could protect her from humiliation. Her death, according to those closest to her, was no accident. It was the final decision of a woman with no other escape. She had, according to hushed voices, taken poison. The family denied it. The press speculated, but the truth remained. Frank's beloved daughter was gone, and with her, the illusion of control he had built into every corner of Winfield Hall began to collapse. News of Edna's death shattered Frank. The man who had conjured an empire from 5-cent coins now stood in his great hall like a statue. Servants recalled him wandering aimlessly, avoiding mirrors, refusing meals. He stopped hosting guests. He stopped issuing orders. He simply retreated into silence. But it was not only grief that filled the halls. Something else took root. Something uncanny. It began with the marble fireplace in the grand hall. Above it, carved in fine detail, was a relief of Frank's 3 daughters, their profiles etched into the stone in a symbolic family crest. Shortly after Edna's funeral, lightning struck the mansion during a summer storm. It wasn't unheard of, but what followed was chilling. The bolt hit the chimney directly and cracked the marble. Not just anywhere, but through Edna's face alone. The other 2 daughters' images were untouched. Servants said the split appeared like a wound. Visitors gasped. Gilbert himself, when called to assess the damage, reportedly turned pale. The crack was not just structural, it was symbolic, a mark of divine judgment or spiritual unrest. The legend spread quickly. People said the house had absorbed the trauma, that Edna's soul, denied peace in life, had been absorbed into the stone. The story became part of Winfield Hall's DNA. From that point forward, the mansion was no longer merely grand, it was haunted. For Frank, the fireproof fortress now felt like a sarcophagus. He avoided the fireplace. He avoided the Empire Room. The very spaces he had built to project his legacy now mirrored his guilt. He had wanted greatness for Edna. But in chasing status, he had locked her in a world of cold expectations. She had been a princess in a palace designed not for love, but for domination. And she had suffocated under its weight. Frank's obsession with control, once his greatest asset, became his prison. He began to spiral inward. He grew obsessive about detail, about silence, about order. The music room went quiet. The organ that once shook the marble now gathered dust. The hallways, once filled with the shuffle of servants and the rustle of evening gowns, became tomb-like. And yet, in this silence, he found no peace. The death of Edna had ripped something open inside him that no money could mend. Even the most opulent fixtures of Winfield Hall could not distract from the absence of her presence. The imperial bedroom, once a place of fantasy and delusion, now reminded him daily of all he had failed to protect. The portraits, the velvet, the gold, none of it mattered anymore. He would sit in his empire bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in memories of a daughter who had once laughed in the garden, back when life still felt real. It was said he began hearing things. Whispers in the hall. Piano keys faintly struck in the distance. The scent of Edna's perfume lingering in rooms long closed. Whether these were real or imagined didn't matter. To Frank, they were visitations. Appearances from a daughter who had become more present in death than in the years she walked those halls. He no longer opened the house to guests. He stopped traveling. He stopped celebrating holidays. His obsession with Napoleon took a grim turn. He saw himself not as emperor, but as exile, like Napoleon on Elba, stripped of purpose, staring at the sea of marble he had once commanded. And yet, he could not leave it. He had built this prison for himself. Winfield Hall, with all its might and beauty, had become a mausoleum not only for Edna, but for him. The house took on an aura. Staff whispered about cold spots, about rooms where flowers would wilt prematurely, about the marble absorbing energy, refusing warmth. Ghost stories multiplied, and always. The crack on the fireplace remained. repaired, patched, even covered at one point. It always returned, like a scar that would not heal, like a wound etched into the very foundation of the house. Frank's grief soon turned into sickness. The man who had once stood tall before crowds and commanded armies of employees now became a shadow in his own home. But the house did not age with him. It remained perfect, timeless, ageless, and that perfection only amplified his decay. His empire may have thrived in the world of commerce, but within these walls, nothing but ghosts remained. The death of Edna had set into motion the true haunting of Winfield Hall. The architecture that was once meant to shield the Woolworths from time had now become a stage upon which time performed its cruelest act. It did not decay the stone, it decayed the people. And there, inside the very house that was supposed to defy death, death had found a way to enter, not through fire, but through sorrow. Frank Woolworth, once the emperor of American retail, now sat alone in a golden cage, visited nightly by memories, shadows, and regrets too heavy for marble to bear. When Frank Woolworth died in April 1919, the silence inside Winfield Hall deepened rather than lifted. His passing did not close a chapter so much as it opened a longer and more painful one. The house he built to defy mortality now outlived its creator, standing immaculate and indifferent, while the family it was meant to glorify slowly unraveled. His widow Jenny, already lost to dementia, drifted through her remaining days like a shadow, unable to comprehend the empire or the grief surrounding her. Responsibility for the Woolworth legacy shifted to the next generation, and with it, the full psychological weight of Winfield Hall descended upon a single fragile figure. That figure was Barbara Hutton, Frank's granddaughter, the child who had discovered her mother Edna's body years earlier and who had grown up surrounded not by parental warmth, but by marble walls and servants trained never to show emotion. At just 7 years old, Barbara inherited a fortune estimated at $28 million, an amount so vast that newspapers could not resist turning her into a symbol. They called her the poor little rich girl, a phrase that would follow her for the rest of her life, like a curse disguised as sympathy. For Barbara, Winfield Hall was not a palace of wonder, but the place where loneliness first took shape. The echoing halls magnified her footsteps, and the cold surfaces reflected a childhood devoid of comfort. Nannies came and went. Tutors rotated. Affection was scheduled, formal, and fleeting. The house was too large for intimacy, too severe for play. Every room reminded her that she belonged to a legacy rather than a family. Psychologically, the damage was irreversible. Barbara learned early that love was transactional and temporary, much like the attention paid to her fortune. As she grew older, she carried the invisible scars of abandonment and trauma, scars first carved into her consciousness within the walls of Winfield Hall. When she reached adulthood, she did what many wounded heirs before and after her would do. She tried to buy love. Barbara married 7 times, each relationship following a familiar pattern of hope, excess, and collapse. Her husbands included princes, actors, playboys, and opportunists, men drawn not to her fragile humanity, but to the vast inheritance attached to her name. Each marriage promised rescue from loneliness and ended in deeper isolation. Where Frank Woolworth had used money to command respect and power, Barbara spent it desperately, believing that generosity could substitute for emotional security. The fortune that had been accumulated 5 cents at a time now drained away in extravagant lifestyles, lavish estates, and costly divorces. Yet no amount of spending filled the void that had opened in her childhood. The shadow of Winfield Hall followed her everywhere, shaping her expectations and her fears. She oscillated between craving attention and recoiling from it, between indulgence and self-destruction. Eating disorders, addictions, and emotional instability plagued her adult life, all symptoms of a trauma that had never been acknowledged, let alone healed. Meanwhile, the mansion itself began to lose its purpose. Without Frank's obsessive presence, Winfield Hall became less a home than an artifact. The costs of maintaining such a vast property were staggering. The world was changing. The Great Depression loomed, and the era of private palaces was fading. What had once been a symbol of ultimate success now represented an unsustainable burden. Attempts to sell the estate failed repeatedly. Buyers were deterred by the astronomical upkeep, the oppressive atmosphere, and the growing reputation of the house as cursed. No one wanted to inherit another family's ghosts. By the late 1930s, less than 2 decades after its completion, Winfield Hall stood largely empty. The rooms that had once echoed with Frank's footsteps and Edna's suppressed sorrow now collected dust. Nature crept closer. Silence settled deeper. The mansion that had been designed to proclaim immortality was aging into irrelevance. Eventually, practicality triumphed over pride. The Woolworth family relinquished the house, and it was sold for a fraction of its original cost. Its new identity was profoundly ironic. Winfield Hall became a girls' school, Grace Downs Academy. The marble halls that had once been meant to humble elite guests now filled with the sounds of students, laughter, footsteps, and ordinary life. Desks replaced gilded furniture. Classrooms replaced drawing rooms. Napoleon's presence faded into the background, reduced to architectural curiosity rather than spiritual obsession. In a strange way, this transformation saved the building. By ceasing to serve one man's ego, the house finally began to serve a community. Yet even this rebirth did not entirely cleanse the past. Stories circulated among students and teachers of unexplained sounds, cold drafts, and a sense of being watched. Some claimed to hear organ music late at night. Others spoke of a woman weeping near the former Empire Room. Whether these stories were imagination or inherited memory mattered less than the fact that the house still carried emotional residue. Buildings, like people, remember. While Winfield Hall adapted, Barbara Hutton continued to decline. The fortune that had once made her the most eligible woman in the world dwindled. Trust funds dissolved. Advisors vanished. By the time of her death in 1979, she was nearly bankrupt, living modestly, far removed from the glamour that had defined her public image. Her end was quiet, almost anonymous, a final contrast to the colossal wealth she had once commanded. The cycle was complete. Frank Woolworth had amassed unimaginable riches to conquer the world that had once dismissed him. His granddaughter inherited those riches without the emotional foundation to survive them. Winfield Hall, the physical manifestation of ambition without affection, had shaped them both in different but equally destructive ways. What began as a monument to success ended as a lesson in psychological cost. The house endured. The people did not. In the end, the golden cage proved more enduring than those trapped inside it, standing as mute testimony to a legacy that confused power with fulfillment and grandeur with love. The end of the Woolworth legacy did not come with the collapse of business or the vanishing of fortunes. It came with silence. By the late 20th century, Winfield Hall stood as both relic and riddle, a palatial corpse, preserved in marble and myth. Generations had passed, fortunes had evaporated, and yet the mansion remained, as cold and majestic as ever. The world changed around it. Skyscrapers rose. Empires of commerce came and went. But Winfield Hall stood still, untouched by time, untouched by love. Barbara Hutton's death in 1979 marked the final note in the Woolworth family's tragic symphony. Once among the richest women in the world, she died nearly penniless, alone in a rented suite. Her fortune gone, her body frail, her mind exhausted by years of isolation and indulgence. With her passing, the name Woolworth no longer evoked visions of grandeur or innovation. It evoked sorrow, waste, and warning. And yet, Winfield Hall still stood. The house was now passed between owners like a gilded burden, admired but rarely inhabited. It served briefly as a corporate retreat, later as a filming location. But no matter its purpose, it never felt like a home. No one could seem to stay long. Visitors spoke of its beauty, yes, but also of its heaviness, of an energy they could not name but always felt. The weight of memory, the echo of grief. But the mansion's final act, its final irony, would come not from within, but from the very force Frank Woolworth had tried most desperately to outwit. On a cold morning in January 2015, nearly a century after its construction, Winfield Hall caught fire. The flames spread with shocking speed, and though the damage was limited, they did not spare the most sacred space in the house, Frank's own empire bedroom. The room modeled after Napoleon's sanctuary, the chamber built with fireproof stone, melted under the fury of the very element it had been designed to repel. The canopied bed turned to cinders. The imperial drapes dissolved into smoke. The ceilings cracked. The walls blistered. The fire had found its way in. For decades, Frank had believed that stone would preserve him, that architecture could silence death. But in the end, it was fire, implacable, timeless, and utterly indiscriminate, that reminded the world no marble is immune. The bedroom burned, and with it, the last illusion of immortality. The moment was poetic beyond measure. The very room where Frank had dreamed of eternal dominance, where he had tried to sleep in the shadow of an emperor, was reduced to ash. The room that had absorbed his delusions, his guilt, his grief, was finally allowed to breathe. It was as though the house itself had exhaled after 100 years. The fire, in that sense, was not just destruction, it was absolution. And perhaps it was mercy. For no house should carry sorrow that long. No space, no matter how grand, should be a grave for dreams. In the years since, Winfield Hall has lingered in limbo, occasionally listed for sale, occasionally rented for shoots or events. It continues to resist being reborn. There are always rumors of restorations, of new chapters, but the house seems stubborn. It does not want to change. It does not want to forget. And perhaps it shouldn't. Because Winfield Hall is more than architecture. It is a mirror. In an age obsessed with success, with image, with building legacies from brands and bios, this house stands as a warning. It tells the story of a man who achieved everything and still died alone, who built the safest house in America but could not protect his daughter from despair, who conquered the retail world but lost every intimate connection that made life worth living. You can walk its halls today and marvel at its craftsmanship, The columns, the carvings, the gold leaf, the mirrors, they are still there. But look closely, and you'll see something else. In the cracks, in the silence, in the weight of the air, you'll see that Winfield Hall was never cursed by ghosts. It was cursed by absence, by the things that should have been there and weren't. Laughter, touch, forgiveness, warmth. And in that way, it is not just Frank's story, it is ours. For we, too, live in a world that often confuses success with significance, visibility with worth, permanence with meaning. Winfield Hall reminds us that love cannot be built in stone. That legacy is not gold leaf on a ceiling. It's a hand held, a voice heard, a life shared. The poor farmer from Rodman, New York, who hated the smell of soil and the limitations of obscurity, may have died in a bed of silk under a roof of marble. But in the end, it was the soil that outlasted him. It was the earth, plain, imperfect, mortal, that welcomed him back. And it is in that final return that we find the deepest truth. The Woolworth Empire was built from nickels, but it was lost through silence. The house stands. The people do not. If you ever visit the gates of Winfield Hall, look past the stone, past the grandeur, peer into the windows. You won't see ghosts. You'll see a reflection of ambition, of failure, of humanity. The fireproof house burned, and in doing so, it told us what no monument ever dares to say. Everything ends, and what remains is love or nothing.